Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Lee Wind, and this is,
Sarah Prager.
and we're here as part of the Book Fest Fall 2023 to talk about how we're not talking about sex, how we can empower kids and teens with our queer history. So before we jump in, we thought we'd say a little hello about who each of us is. So Sarah, why don't you start?
Yeah. So I am the author of 4 books for young people teaching our queer history, which is so important. And I'm so excited to chat with Lee and all of you about that and how to do that, why to do that, uh, all of that. My first book is Queer There and Everywhere, 27 People Who Changed the World, and that's a young adult book. The second edition of it, revised and expanded, just came out in June 2023. My other books are middle grade books and a elementary school level picture book. All of these books share the stories of queer people from ancient history through today and their contributions to the world, their own coming out stories, and things like that. But especially why their stories matter to non-queer people and queer people alike. Most of them are biography based. My most recent one in May 2023, A Child's Introduction to Pride, also includes some non-history content like what are pronouns, what is coming out, what does LGBTQ mean, and what are the definitions of all of the words that those acronym letters stand for, and some intro content like that for ages 8 to 12 or so. And it's got a pull-out poster. And all of these are illustrated. So, and more of introduction to me is that I live in Massachusetts with my family, and I've loved queer history for a very long time. I'm a full-time writer and speaker on the topic, and yeah, I love ice cream. Yeah, let's learn about Lee.
That's hysterical. I'm glad you like ice cream. I like ice cream too. And I love your books. I actually have your most recent right
Oh,
here because I
thanks.
thought it was so great. Uh, my name is Lee Wind. Dave, we can go to the next slide. Thank you. I have 3 books out and 5 more coming out in the next couple of years. Many of them are about queer history. My first book was a novel inspired by a piece of queer history. So I'm gay, and I didn't know that anybody else was gay in the history of the world when I was growing up, and I didn't come out until my 20s. So I spent a lot of time pretending to be straight and dating girls, and just thinking, kind of knowing that it was what my parents wanted and what society wanted, but um, not really feeling what I knew I was supposed to feel. And then finally got honest with myself and with everybody else, and came out at 25. And then about 10 years later, I went to a talk, and this guy was talking about the letters that Abraham Lincoln wrote Joshua Fry Speed that convinced him that Abraham was in love with Joshua. And that completely blew my mind. And I was like, how can that possibly be true? But I went to the library and I got out a book that had the letters, and it rocked my world. Like, there was a moment where Abraham writes Joshua and says, they lived together for 4 years, the two guys, and shared a bed. And then after 4 years, Joshua moved back to Kentucky and married a woman named Fanny. And 8 months later, Abraham writes something that says, "Are you now in feeling as well as judgment glad that you're married as you are?" And that was exactly how I felt when I dated girls. And that completely changed my view of history, because there was a reflection of me. I became convinced that Abraham and Joshua were in love. And I basically wrote a book called Queer as a $5 Bill, because Abraham Lincoln is on the $5 bill, about a kid that sort of has the same goosebump experience I did of discovering these letters and deciding he's going to out Abraham Lincoln to change the world. So that's a YA novel, but all the things that the main character discovers about Abraham Lincoln are actually true. There's a ton of footnotes and stuff at the end. And then I was so inspired by that, I thought, well, maybe there was so much evidence that came up. I kept thinking, well, maybe there's a nonfiction book here too. But I didn't particularly like history when I was growing up. It was very dusty and sort of taught like names and dates to memorize. It wasn't stories that related to me or anybody I cared about. So I kind of checked out about history. So the idea that I grew up to write history books cracks me up. But No Way They Were Gay is for readers 11 and up. The first book is a YA, so 13 and up, because there's some major homophobia that the character needs to confront. No Way They Were Gay, it's 12 really in-depth chapters about different people in history: men who love men, women who love women, people who love without regard to gender, and then people who lived outside of the gender binary. And I really, really love that book. And it's my opportunity to sort of hold space for the primary sources and let these voices from history come out, including one chapter, as you can see on the bottom right corner, is about Abraham Lincoln and his love affair with Joshua Fry Speed. And then not every book has a queer content, but they all sort of have a social justice sort of angle. And Red and Green and Blue and White is actually a social justice story, also inspired by a true story in history, which maybe we'll get time to talk about later. But here we're talking about how what Sarah and I are doing is really, we're not talking about sex. We're talking about identity. We're talking about who somebody's in love with. And we're not playing CSI history. We're really trying to get to the heart of who these people in history were. Sarah, did you like history when you were in school and growing up?
Only queer history, because honestly, like you, discovering it blew my mind, discovering that there were queer people in history too. For me, I came out when I was 14, at the beginning of freshman year of high school, and learning queer history helped to develop my sense of identity and community. It gave me so much. It helped me to feel like I wasn't the only person in the world that had ever felt this way. And just like you, like reading letters and like those primary sources actually was really formative. And it wasn't until much later that I specifically found out about Abraham Lincoln. And he's one of the 27 biographies in Queer There and Everywhere. And I think he's one of the most important people's story to share. And the homophobia in the historical record of historians doing anything to explain away, like there must be a heterosexual explanation for this. Like, yes, they shared a bed for 4 years, but
that was really common on the frontier.
That was really common on
the frontier.
That's where a scarcity and blah, 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 blah. Like, not to mention that Joshua Fry Speed was a bed salesman, and like there like was literally like they once like
Dave, you can take down the slide while we're chatting.
like there was explaining away, instead of coming at history from a neutral perspective, coming at it from a straight perspective, and then needing a burden of proof to find queerness. It's like, well, someone must be straight and cisgender for sure. Obviously, there's no possibility that they were queer unless you can find a ton of evidence, as if every person ever has written down every date and crush and thought they've ever had. And if they couldn't get married, how much evidence, hard evidence, is there besides their crime of sodomy being recorded or something like that? So validating Lincoln's story from the letters that there were and the fact that he shared this bed and things like that is part of the idea of looking at history from a different perspective of what if queer historians were looking at this? What if open-minded historians were looking at this? And what if the historical record were being examined not from only the perspective of everybody is straight and cisgender. And
And if you open up your mind to the possibility that, oh, well, maybe Abraham was in love with Joshua, then suddenly things in his experience make sense. Like
yeah,
there's this fatal first, the day that he experienced the beginning of his most, terrible depression of his entire life. And generally, historians are like, yeah, no idea why he was really depressed, but like
months
it
in
was
bed.
the same week that Joshua told him he was moving to Kentucky after they lived together for 4 years. Like it was the exact same week. So it's
Mm-hmm.
like if you look at the actual like what happened and the letters, it totally makes sense. But generally, historians are like, yeah, well, so we don't know. He really suffered
Yeah, I
from
mean,
depression.
they were good friends. That
His marriage
happened.
to Mary was really troubled. Well, yeah.
So troubled. Yeah, one person said it looked as if he was going to the slaughter when they on their wedding day. So, um, yeah, like it is. I mean, we say mind blowing, but the empowerment that a queer young person can get from finding out that someone like Abraham Lincoln and these other famous people, Eleanor Roosevelt is also somebody who's both in Queer There and Everywhere and No Way They Were Gay. Um, Finding out that those people were queer and that information is kind of kept from us. Um, so often because the teachers themselves never learned this, even, and now because it's legislated a way that they're not allowed to teach it if they do know it. Uh, that information being kept from us is so harmful. And it's so important for non-queer youth to learn that queer people have been around, um, being heroes and influencing the world in incredible ways for all of history, right? Like,
Yeah, like Shakespeare. Shakespeare wrote 126 love sonnets to another guy. We even know the opening lines of some of the sonnets. Uh, but we don't know that he wrote them to a guy because they changed the pronouns, and for 150 years made it look like all of the 150 some sonnets were all written to a woman. But like one of the sonnets even starts out and says, "Two loves have I of comfort and despair, which like two spirits do suggest me still. The better angel is a man right fair, the worser spirit a woman colored ill." That's sonnet 144. You can go read about it, but in school we didn't learn the sonnets. We learned, Romeo and Juliet and
yeah.
Shakespeare, Hamlet. Um, so it's like
And
so
well,
important.
speaking of poetry, like for me, the term lesbian is very important. I've been to the island of Lesbos. I've been to Sappho's birthplace. I have two tattoos. They're both Sappho related, lesbian related. I have a line of her poetry in Greek on my back, actually, with the Isle of Lesbos's outline around it. And the line is actually, it's translated different ways, but like, I believe someday they will remember us. And I love the idea that like these people can live on through our memories. But I know you've written about Sappho, right?
Yeah,
And maybe
and
we can put up the Sappho slide.
so the learning about Sappho before I thought that what was really interesting about history, about queer people in history, was that we were the footnote, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, well, there were these famous people, and by the way, they were men who loved men or women who loved women. But when it came to researching Sappho, my mind got blown. I was reading this great book for adults by Dr. Christine Downing called Myths and Mysteries of Same-Sex Love. And in it, she analyzed some of Sappho's poetry. So Sappho was like a rock star of the time. You have to imagine it wasn't like this is a fresco from like hundreds of years after Sappho lived. It's completely a figment of the artist's imagination. Sappho did not write her poems down in a journal that she got at the local, drugstore. This was like way before that. It was spoken word poetry, right? Like slam poetry. She performed with a lyre instrument, a stringed instrument, and she sang her poems and sort of like, and
Right.
then they were written down by other people that heard them. And then those translations were passed around, and they wrote them on things like papyrus. And this is a fragment of Sappho's poems that survived on pieces of papyrus to the right. Sappho was famous for two things. She was famous for being an incredible poet. Homer called her the 10th muse, which was a big compliment back then.
Mhm.
And she was also famous because a lot of her poems talked about her loving other women. She wrote this one poem that we think is pretty much intact. And so all the other poets of the day, of Sappho's time, really felt that like expression, they were all guys. And what they praised as the most beautiful and the most powerful thing on the face of the earth were pretty much expressions of toxic masculinity. They were like, warships going off to battle, and, cavalry charging, and infantry, marching to war. And Sappho took that idea and she flipped it on its head. And she said that she thinks the most beautiful thing on the dark earth is actually the person you love. And she said, because now far away Anactoria comes to my mind, for I would rather watch her moving in her lovely way and see her face flashing radiant than all the force of Lydian chariots and their infantry in full display of arms. Now, something about this resonated so strongly with people of that time that it actually has resonated all the way down to us today. And if you stop and you think about all the Disney movies that end with the kiss of true love, um, the story that was written 800 years ago in France, the Sleeping Beauty, what wakes Sleeping Beauty from the evil spell? It's the kiss of true love. This all traces back to Sappho. And we all, she was the first person to say that love is the most important thing in the world. Stop anybody on the street and ask them what's the most powerful thing in the universe. They'll probably say love. And we believe it because Sappho was brave enough to say it first, was insightful enough to say it first. So that completely got me like, what? That's so cool. So that's the thing. It's not just a footnote. It's like, it's kind of because some of these people were queer, they were able to make these incredible contributions. And I have one more cool example, Mahatma Gandhi. So David, you can go to the next slide, please. So this is what the opening chapters look like in my book. So Gandhi was actually in love with this guy, this German Jewish architect whose name was Hermann Kallenbach. And there's a beautiful quote from one of their letters here, where Gandhi is writing Kallenbach and talking about how we can therefore but go forward as far forward as our legs will carry us and no farther, and still be together, one soul and two bodies. So really, that language of being a soulmate was Gandhi's, was Mohandas's language, about his relationship with Herman, and not his relationship with his wife Kasturba, with whom they had 4 children. So Gandhi was really involved politically in the protests that Gandhi was organizing, and he was one of the organizers, and in fact owned a really big farm where they housed a lot of the people that were displaced by the protests, that when they kind of lost their colonial jobs and protesting, they were put up on Kallenbach's farm. But if you look at the overall scope, and I read all of Gandhi's writings are in the public domain, and I read them online, and there are over 200 letters back and forth between Gandhi and Kallenbach over the years, and it starts to really make sense. Like, Gandhi was the guy who had this huge breakthrough in humanity, right, in our understanding of humanity, by saying, let people's religions be different. You worship a being, a single entity, as Allah, and another adores him as Khuda. I worship him as Ishwar. How does anyone stand to lose? You worship facing one way and I worship facing the other. Why should I become your enemy for that reason? We all belong to the human race. We all wear the same skin. We hail from the same land. Like, that is a huge turning point in humanity. And the fact that Gandhi was in love with this German Jewish guy at the time that he wrote that cannot be coincidental, in my view. I don't think that's a coincidence. That feels like that's part of Gandhi's evolution in his understanding about humanity. And I think
Yeah.
that is super, super exciting.
Yeah. And I mean, with both of these people, you're talking about love. And, when we're talking about not talking about sex, it's very easy to just kind of swap that out when we're writing for children too. Like when Frida Kahlo is in each of my bio books. when I write it for teens, they're like she was bisexual, and her sexuality is at a teen level, like other YA books in my YA book. But in Rainbow Revolutionaries, where everybody gets a one-page biography, you mentioned we're talking about identity. This one-page bio here is talking about her as a painter. It's talking about her as a disabled person, and the accident that put her in this bed. It's talking about her Mexican identity and things like that. And there's one line that said, Frida loved men and women. And that's just mentioning a part of her identity. And it uses the word loved instead of slept with men and women. And so if we're going to talk about, I even choose to say loved men and women instead of using the identity label of bisexual, because then I'd need to go on and explain the term bisexual and put in a glossary and things like that. And I felt that was simplest for this age group. And then when I talk about Frida for elementary school level, she's right here on this cover. The way that I chose to approach people here was coming up with one positive attribute of each person. You can be poetic like Sappho. You can be inventive, creative like Leonardo da Vinci, etc. And you can be artistic like Frida. And I don't actually even mention anything about being bi here. It's just that everyone in this book is LGBTQ, and on the last page it says that all these people are LGBTQ plus, which means they're as diverse as the rainbow. And that's it. It just says she was proud of who she was, and we're connecting with readers with what interests them. So it says she created beautiful paintings that showed herself sometimes with cute animals. So, I'm not talking about where her heart is exposed and things like that for this age group, just like I'm not talking about her sex life for this age group. I'm making even her paintings age appropriate. And I think the idea is even just introducing these people so that when they're older, they can go find out about all of her more adult paintings and everything like that when they're ready. But they've been introduced to these names now. But anyway, you've also been saying that these people are... Anyway, you just talking about love put me off on all that, because it just made me think of how I wrote that line, like Frida loved men and women. And so even though we're talking about identity, we're also talking about love, which is it is foundational to queer identity. And I think that's beautiful.
I'm going to skip ahead in our outline a tiny bit just to say that I really like the word. I think the word homosexual is really problematic because it makes everybody outside the queer community really focus on the fact that what distinguishes queer people is that we have sex in a way that makes them uncomfortable. And I think that if we change the focus to be about love, if we use the word homolovule, or like the old-fashioned term homophile, which is based on, is it Greek, that the phile?
Yeah. So like, it's like the Greek suffix, but I think there was a movement in the 50s or 60s to have the homophile movement to replace, because I mean the word homosexual was used by the scientific community against us,
it's kind of clinical,
as a diagnosis of mental illness, and there were laws against homosexual activity and things like that. So it is a really stigmatized word too. But you're saying the people do go to they sexualizing queer identity is part of what makes people uncomfortable with us. That is part of the movement against, to go off again.
Right. That's what's going on in
Blaming
politics right now, right?
Yeah,
They're saying
it
that
is.
any mention of our existence is
Is
sexualized, but it's not.
sexualizing it. Yeah, and it's absolutely not. And I think that it's like saying that a book about a prince and a princess is sexual. That's talking about the sexual orientation of heterosexuality. A children's book about a prince and a prince, which exists and is banned, it's completely just simple homophobia to ban a book about a prince and a prince when you don't see how a prince and a princess book is the same thing. And it, that's what we're saying here, because when we're talking about Abraham Lincoln's love for Joshua Fry Speed, we're saying this the same thing of like he also had a relationship with Mary Todd. Like if people are taught the name Mary Todd, they should also know the name Joshua Fry Speed. And so when we know these people's spouses' names, we know the name Martha Washington. So all we want is for people to be able to say, and this man had a male partner. And that's not sexual. That is because we're not describing what they do in bed. We're just saying they loved each other and they were partners. And so, it's not sexualizing at all. I have kids. They know I'm gay. Like, it's not anything gross or inappropriate for children to know somebody's identity just like any other identity. Like, they know I'm a woman. And it's not difficult for them to understand that they have two moms. It's not difficult for friends to know that some of their parents have one mom, some of their parents have step parents. That's just, and books should reflect the world around you. And the same with history books. They should reflect all of history. And authors are skilled at doing that in age-appropriate ways. We can introduce tough history in age-appropriate ways. And, much of this is joyful and hero-based and things like that. Let's bring up the next slides about how we were starting to say how we're kind of not just some footnotes of how it's like cool little trivia that like a couple of these people might have happened to be, but we're saying like these whole concepts or influential figures. It's like when you start looking, it's many influential figures and many of the inventions that have contributed to the entire like the foundation of society has queer people have been there throughout all of it, contributing to it. So these are some pages from my latest book, A Child's Introduction to Pride, where again, there's nothing sexual or inappropriate about this. This is just this is from Black Dog and Leventhal's A Child's Introduction to series, where it's a child's introduction to Greek mythology, to music, to African American history, to the night sky, etc. They are just introductions. And so it's part of a well-rounded education to know Black history, ancient Egypt, etc. And this is LGBTQIA plus history. So this is one little section of contributions to the world in my book. And it's some pretty interesting stuff that most adults don't know. So you might guess that music, like Broadway, etc. I've got like Ricky Martin and so many people, Elton John. Like, yeah, when you think about it, music has a lot of contributions from queer people, right? But there's also America the Beautiful, written by Catherine Lee Bates. A poem by her, the lyrics became America the Beautiful. She had a female partner. There's, I mean, Erin Copeland. There's the mother of the blues, Ma Rainey, is on here. There's just so many. And Tchaikovsky, the composer, etc.
Tchaikovsky's in No Way They Were Gay too, because I was like, what?
Yeah. So just imagine the world of music without these contributions, right? We can go to the next. Literature, which BookFest participants I'm sure will be interested in. So for a child's introduction to Pride, I wanted to make sure that I put in children's books because they may not have yet learned about some of the classics that they may read in high school. So I put in Goodnight Moon by Margaret Wise Brown, who was queer, and Where the Wild Things Are by Maurice Sendak, who was gay and had a male life partner for over 50 years. And he was closeted until his parents passed away late in his life. So Lorraine Hansberry was the playwright for A Raisin in the Sun and was the first Black woman to have a play performed on Broadway with that. We have James Baldwin, Walt Whitman, Virginia Woolf, Gertrude Stein, Emily Dickinson, who lived in my area, etc. Ancient poets from around the world, and so on.
Sarah, you made such a good point. It's like it's not a footnote. It's like our world wouldn't be the same without the contributions of us queer people.
I know. And I love the idea with this children's literature. Most of us had no idea that these queer voices were in our bedrooms from our parents' mouths, like our whole lives. Most people didn't know that queer voices were raising us this whole time. That's really special to me. Okay.
Dave, go to the next slide. Thanks.
Yeah. The arts. The arts has been a haven for queer people. When other places wouldn't hire us, we went out and expressed ourselves creatively in other places, cabaret and so many different things. You brought up Sleeping Beauty, the famous Disney castle that is in Germany, southern Germany. I don't know how to pronounce it. Neuschwanstein, I think. The person who oversaw its construction was gay. That's on here.
I love that.
The one that Walt Disney based Cinderella's castle on. So we have Da Vinci, we have Michelangelo. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the Mona Lisa, the Last Supper, the David. They have more. I just chose a couple from each of them. It goes on. I have Andy Warhol on there. I put Frida Kahlo, the Mexican painter. Georgia O'Keeffe, not much of a surprise. And, fashion designers like Jason Wu, designer for Michelle Obama. So many areas of the arts. Jonathan Van Ness, just truly, you can't imagine some of these areas like fashion design existing without queer people for all time. All right, and then the last slide from this section is the sciences, which queer people are underrepresented in this area now because of discrimination in the field. But we have existed here forever as well. So I've got a satellite radio here with a trans pride flag because satellite radio was invented by a trans woman, Martine Rothblatt, the founder of Sirius Radio. She is also like a futurist and roboticist, and the first one of the like biggest CEOs, and just like really impressive person. Lynn Conway is also an inventor. She was fired by IBM in the 1960s for transitioning from male to female publicly at work, and was fired for that at the time. And she went on much later to have a successful career in tech. But she was working on, at the time, foundational work in microprocessors that are in like all our phones and tablets today. Alan Turing basically invented the computer. He was also prosecuted and ended up dying from homophobic prosecution by the British government for being gay. But before that, he helped the Allies to win World War II with the invention of the computer. It goes on. Trans man Alan L. Hart was a doctor who helped to pioneer X-ray technology and helped to save countless lives by using that to detect tuberculosis in the lungs earlier. And Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, also had a female partner for many years before she passed. So
sadly, she didn't reveal until her obituary, but
her obituary,
you're still happy to have her.
Yes, and Tam carries on a foundation in her name.
Yeah, cool.
So foundational, and putting this in a children's book is important. And like I said, it's why wouldn't we do units on this in Women's History Month and Black History Month of what are women's contributions to history? What are Black people's contributions to history? It's empowering and important for students of those identities, and also extremely important for everybody to know that people of those identities have been foundational to the creation of society. They all have. We have been there too. And that is not inappropriate to teach.
No. And sometimes it's hiding right in front of our faces. The next slide, I believe, is Bayard Rustin. And so we've all heard of we're all very familiar with the Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. But when Bayard Rustin was the openly gay man that actually organized the March on Washington, where Dr. King gave that speech, and there's this incredible story about how the morning of the march, people hadn't shown up yet, and a bunch of reporters came up to Bayard and they were like, "Hey, what gives? Is this going to be a failure?" And he reportedly looked at a piece of paper and he was like, "Nope, everything's right on time." And and then it ended up being this huge success. What nobody knew, though, was the piece of paper was blank and that he was totally bluffing.
Totally bluffing. I saw that story too. He's also one of the Queer There and Everywhere stories. He's just an incredible story. And, he studied Gandhian nonviolence in India, which is like a connection to the Gandhi that you were talking about. Let's skip ahead in the deck and put up the Bayard slide if you want.
Yeah, well, we can do this slide too.
Or can you skip?
Yeah. So Bayard was interviewed in 1986, and they said, do you have any advice for other Black gay activists? And he said, if we want to do away with the injustice to gays, it will not be done because we get rid of the injustice to gays. It will be done because we are forwarding the effort for the elimination of injustice for all. And this is really about building coalitions between people. And he talked about how in the civil rights movement, the goal of the Black community was not to get prejudiced white people to love Black people. It was to create the kind of America legislatively, morally, and psychologically such that people could not openly manifest their hate. And I think that in the previous administration, what happened in America is that we sort of slid back towards a kind of America that it was okay to manifest that hate. So it's these issues that felt like so of the moment in the civil rights movement. There's still the things we're grappling with today, and there's still so much wisdom from the queer people that were leaders in the past that we can move forward today. And if we can go to the next slide, when we're talking about empowerment, there's this incredible story about the pharaoh Hatshepsut. So thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt, there was a pharaoh who she was 16 years old at the time that her husband, who was also her brother, because that's how they rolled in ancient Egypt, died. And there was no male heir. There was a 2-year-old nephew. And now he was the only male heir to this whole dynasty. And so at 16 years old, she convinced all the ruling elite of Egypt to let her rule as regent for the nephew. And then a few years on, she declared herself co-king and then senior co-king. And then over 22 years of ruling Egypt, basically being the person ruling Egypt with this young child who was then growing up to a teen and then a teenager, a preteen and then a teenager, she transformed her public persona from, you can see in these 3 statues over the course of 22 years, from really presenting completely as a woman to presenting in this sort of in-between gender phase where there's a lot of there's no shirt, but they're not really breasts, but it's not a flat male chest, to a completely male public persona. And the idea that a ruler of a country could basically change how they publicly present their gender sounds like it's something that could never possibly happen today. It's too modern. Gender fluidity is too modern and too weird. It's not. 2,000 thousands and thousands of years ago, Hatshepsut did it, and it was a hugely successful pharaoh. Egypt was had a very good era. But then after Hatshepsut died, the co-king, right, the younger king, spent 10 years trying to erase all evidence of Hatshepsut having existed. So there are actually hieroglyphics where just her image is chiseled out. But you can still sort of see the silhouette, and there's a photo of that in the book. But what's so amazing is that it's really, really empowering for kids to know that, like, hey, I'm not the first person like me. I'm not the first person in the world. Like, I have a history. And I really believe that if kids know that they have a past, they'll believe that they deserve a place at the table today. And if you know that you deserve a place at the table today, then I think the future is infinite.
Yes. Knowing that you're rooted in something and that you're not you come from somewhere, and you didn't make this up in your head, really means something. And hearing from people, adults today who haven't received this education, who do think that this is something that this generation has completely invented, without knowing that trans and non-binary people and identities, not necessarily with those, or not with those, that language and terms, but the gender binary is much newer than trans identities, and gender fluidity. It was extremely common and honored and revered and respected, and common in many pre-colonial societies. And that is so important for adults and youth to know in accepting trans youth today. And like you said, for trans youth to know that they yeah, they're not just, I mean, kind of like I said, when I was a young person, it made me feel like I wasn't the first person to have ever felt this way. And that meant the world to me as a teenager. People were telling me, like, being a girl who likes girls, you're doing it for attention as a teenage girl, or it's a phase, or it's a fad. People are doing it to be popular. Those are things that you're hearing, and knowing it legitimizes it almost, to know that there's a history. And
It's impossible for kids today to think that they're the only one, right? Like almost everybody has a smartphone, so and we have queer people in the news and on TV. Like you're not going to put that genie back in the bottle. Like they're going to know queer people exist. So now that the ground is shifted, and they're trying to steal the history, what little we've been able to reclaim, and they're trying to say like, oh well, you're all brand new. We're not new.
not
We've
new.
been around since the beginning of time across the world in all different cultures. And knowing that is super, super empowering for everybody. Because I think that once you know that the way that history has been taught has left out queer people, you're suddenly like, well, wait a minute, it's also left out women, and it's also left out disabled people, and it's also left out people of color, and it's also left out indigenous people. And there's an opportunity for the liberation of all the groups that are underrepresented in terms of how history has been told. And that I think becomes very exciting. And then our books, as wonderful as they are just the start, right?
Yeah,
It's just the start of a journey.
right.
We're not writing
What else do I need
encyclopedias.
to start learning that I was missing? And how can I use this as a starting point to look at history and everything from an entirely new perspective? What perspective have I been looking at things from? Yeah. I think we're out of time,
We did
actually.
it. We talked about how, let's not talk about sex.
Yeah, we talked about everything but a little bit. So let's put up our final slide, because people can hopefully learn more, use this as a starting point, just like the readers can learn our books as a starting point. Thank you for your books that are making such a difference in the world. And I know you said you have 5 upcoming releases, so people have a lot to see at your site. I'm excited for all of them.
Oh, thanks, Sarah. And right back at you. This is so fun because it's everybody can look at the primary sources and kind of like interpret it on their own. And what I love is that we're both going into the same like vast uncharted world of queer history, and we're coming out with some of the same stories and some different stories, and
Yeah.
we tell them with our own flavor. And it's just I couldn't be happier to have done this with you. So thank you.
Yeah, there's no shortage, which is very exciting. Thank you so much for chatting together about our favorite stuff tonight.
And
This
thanks to
afternoon.
everybody at the Book Fest and Book Fest Fall 2023. And
Thank you,
if you can make
BookFest.
it to the live chat, we'll be there.
Yep.